from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? And lastly, to what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? You may begin.
According to professors and digital history authors Stephen Mintz and Sarah McNeil, the American revolutionaries believed in natural rights, the idea that the people have certain fundamental rights that must be protected against tyrannical oppression, including the right to trial by jury, freedom of speech and conscience, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and punishment. Revolutionary principles are about the idea that people have the right to revolt against government that violates their natural rights. Today, we will present these principles by saying LOL, Locke and Liberty.
L. Locke. John Locke's most famous belief was that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. The revolutionary principles include popular sovereignty, equality before the law, constitutional rights, and rule of law. The Declaration of Independence says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall be most likely to affect their safety and happiness. John Locke inspired revolutionists in our country to add this to their Declaration of Independence, which can be seen in the quote, "Revolt. It is the right of the people." The framers of the Constitution used these principles to set the foundation of their new government. The First Amendment states the Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or expression. In this amendment, Americans' liberty is protected. American citizens are also promised the protection of property through the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. They shall not be violated.
O. Ordains. President Calvin Coolidge said, if all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their powers just from the consent of the governed, that is final. Without the principle of consent, a government cannot serve its democratic purposes because the people would have no voice in how they are governed. Explicit consent is a direct acknowledgement of consent by the people in the Constitution. When the Constitution was proposed to the 9 states, 9 of the 13 states had to ratify the Constitution for it to become the new government system in America. American citizens implicitly consent to the U.S. Constitution by abiding by its laws. In contrast, implicit consent is consent that is implied by the government. For instance, the current debate over travel immunization passports for COVID-19 has emphasized the right that citizens have to freely travel within our borders. John Locke believed that men being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent. No one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. This quote describes the social contract theory that a legitimate government cannot exist in a society without the consent of the people.
L. Liberty. John Stuart Mill believed the aim of patriots was to set limits to the power which the ruler should be suffered to exercise over the community, and this limitation was what they meant by liberty. The Constitution protects the government and the people from this form of tyranny through the system of checks and balances. For example, Article 2, Section 2 states that the president shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. The president, although politically powerful, still must collaborate with the Senate to perform certain duties. Both Plato and Aristotle agreed that to protect the liberties of the people, there needed to be separation of power through checks and balances, so the government did not become tyrannical. Aristotle believed the best form of government was mixed government, when neither the mob nor the few have total power. When the power is shared between the two groups, the government is most successful.
Locke ordains liberty. These 3 things helped shape the United States Constitution during the founding period. Founding father Benjamin Rush said, "Patriotism is as much a virtue as justice and is as necessary for the support of societies as affection is for the support of families." Remember this. LOL. We are now for questions.
Great, thank you all very much for your prepared remarks. Heard a lot about the importance of the consent of the governed, but I wonder if maybe there's an inherent potential flaw in that. What happens when the people are misled or misinformed? Does that cause any tension or problems with the idea of consent of the governed?
This may, so if there is tension between, the government and the people, this may cause issues with consent of the governed. But the idea is that the people have consent, and that's what's important. To have a legitimate government, there needs to be consent, and this is the overall idea.
When people are misinformed, their consent might possibly change, or they might think that they have changed their consent. But when they are misinformed, they're also most likely being manipulated in some way by another person. So then is that really their true consent, or is it just what they believe is their true consent?
Let me take Mr. Murphy's question just a little bit further. What, and if we're talking about consent in today's United States, what are some indications of consent?
Well,
Or what
I feel like
constitutes consent?
I feel like the social contract is a big one there. And it's like, if you are born in the United States and you live in the United States, the social contract says that you agree to these pretty much through implicit consent.
You think the majority of people today have heard of the concept of social contract?
I think that social contract is growing in popularity, especially because the education system, I would say, is improving. The social contract theory is definitely something that is very important to our society and something to understand. So I think that, yes, more people have heard of it, and hopefully more people will continue to hear about it in the future through education.
Thank
Adding
you.
on to that,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry. Adding on to that, I believe that although people might not have heard of the social contract, they are living it in their day-to-day lives. So they might not be able to need to know about it, but they might know the general concept of it if they don't know the official name.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, it's interesting. Let's carry on down that line of thinking. And in your prepared response in referring to the social contract, you mentioned that Locke's talking about that people need to be free, equal, and independent. Do we have equality to really make that whole system actually work?
I mean, sort of to answer that question, inevitably theoretically, it sounds good on paper, but there will never be like true equality. That is why we have a system of checks and balances. So for example, the president, as we've stated, cannot do anything without the consent of the Senate. So while things might not be perfectly balanced out or equal, we are trying our best to initiate that through the system of checks and balances. That's just one example of this.
Well, let me redirect a little bit, and let's take the sense of equality into political equality. Us citizens, right? If we're this is what it's all about, right? Is we're giving our consent to be governed. Is there really any political equality, whether it be in a representative system or election procedures and processes?
Well, we're definitely aiming for a representative government. So that's why we have, senators and representatives. So hopefully more and a majority of people within a community can be equally represented. However, there are flaws in this. We aren't representing every single person individually, but we are trying to represent the mass majority of people. And again, hopefully with time, we can have more representation within our government.
As well, we are using do have laws protecting from manipulation of the system as well, for like racial gerrymandering and that kind of stuff.
If we think about staying on with consent and electoral representation, the Electoral College system that we have to elect the president, how does that fit into this conversation about consent of the governed and will of the people representation, that sort of thing?
Well, the Electoral College is a bit confusing if we're being honest, but
Certainly
it does
is.
get across the main idea that people are being represented. So we are, together as the United States, for example, we pick the president through the Electoral College, and with the Electoral College, the hope is that we get more representation.
Adding on to that, and going back to the original question, although Electoral College may seem at first like it is not to the consent of the governed. We can go back to what we were talking about earlier about how people can be misled. And that is why the Electoral College is in place. So even if people are misled, there are those educated people who understand that the people are misled and can somehow still make the good choices for our country.
Adding on to what both of my colleagues have said, I agree with this. And to build off of that, in America, the current population is something like 330 million. So currently we are the third most populated country in the world. So there's a lot of people here, and therefore there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of ideas. And in most instances, because our country is so diverse, because there are so many different ideas, not everyone can be represented. So the reason we have the system of electoral college is so that major ideas that are out there can be represented, like certain groups of people can be represented through the system of electoral college.
So let's go to the right of revolution. Shift gears a little bit. Does that right still exist today for the average American citizen?
Yes, it does, but only when the government becomes in breaching on your rights as a human being within the United States, which the Constitution grants us. That's when it is our duty as citizens to alter or abolish the existing government.
Just to build off what my counterpart is saying, basically when our natural rights are being violated, there is a right to revolution, there is a right to revolt. And this still is applicable to today because we can still see a threat of a tyrannical government or people who can violate our rights. And so because of this, there's always going to be that possibility for the right to revolution.
So was the insurrection on January 6th justified under the right to revolution?
Well, it depends on whether you believe that the government was infringing upon people's rights, which there's no proof of that being true. So no.
Building off of what my colleague just said, I don't think that the riot that occurred on January 6th was justified under revolt because in contrast, back during the revolution, the British government was being tyrannical and violating the natural rights of the American colonists. So therefore that was justified. Whereas on January 6th, there was no actual evidence of the rioters' natural rights being violated.
Finish your thought if you wish, or is that okay?
Just what I was saying, there is no real evidence of the rioters' natural rights being violated. They just didn't agree with the outcome of a presidential election.
All right, thank you very much. That was outstanding. So this time we're moving to some follow-up comments. You all know the system very well. First, let me say thank you. That was a really excellent conversation. I enjoyed your prepared response. I thought it was well organized. You addressed issues in the question appropriately. And I like that you really began to dig deeply into some of these words, right? Words, it's what we live on. And you're digging into the difference between explicit and implicit consent, ideas like that, looking at this notion of free, equal, independent citizens. I liked your work on the social contract. I'm a big Lockean reader, and I appreciate that. I like that you were able to disagree with each other, right, without being disagreeable, right? And that's so important for citizens, right? We need to learn how to talk to each other, and we know there's a lot of viewpoints out there, and we can just talk to each other, and we can then have a really nice conversation. What I would hope that you'll continue to think about, your young adults, you're going to be moving on to university days and taking over our country one of these days, and I feel in good hands with that, but keep digging deeply into these principles and what does it mean to be a citizen of a state versus a citizen of a country? And how do those two seemingly contradictory identities, how can they coexist? And how does our system work in order to make that process work? And just something to think about, and good luck tomorrow.
I'll jump in next and say that one of the reasons that I like being a judge for Unit 1 in particular is how messy and knotty and unblack and white the questions are and the answers should be as a result. And I think you guys did a good job of understanding that nuance. And like Mr. Fox was saying, even sort of slight variations in words can sort of have a kind of a fundamental change of definition. So I think that you guys were well equipped to sort of handle that nuance. I would encourage you to continue to be comfortable in those gray areas. Not every question has to have a definitive answer, and that's sort of the spice of life. That's what makes this sort of stuff so much fun. Is the nuance in the gray area. I would just close by saying I think it was effectively organized. The LOL. I certainly get it. It's effectively organized. It's catchy, but also it's followed up with substance. So I think that worked out. That was very effective. It worked out really well for you. And then just the breadth of evidence that was listed was very impressive. So well done, everyone.
And I'll add my compliments and commendations as well, along with a thanks for participating in all the work it takes, as well as a thank you to your teacher and all those that help you get to this point. I'll just add on or sort of repeat, I guess, to some extent what my fellow judges have referenced. You had a good breadth of knowledge. I thought your opening and introductions, just even of your personal selves with your favorite philosopher, was both interesting and clever, and the LOL piece that followed that. You were able to, as has been pointed out, you would make a case and someone may make a counterpoint, which is part of what critical thinking is. And as Mr. Fox said, how we can have a discussion and not always agree, but get along. So that's a critical piece facing all of us today. I would have, had I gotten to another question, I would have followed up a little. A couple of you had Plato and Aristotle referenced. It was your favorite philosopher for a couple of you. Just the distinctions between classical republicanism and natural rights and some of that little bit of conflict, because you referenced diversity, and in a country as diverse as this, does that start to, where does classical republicanism go with some of its principles? Does it go out the window, or is it still workable, or those kinds of things? So anyway, nicely done. We wish you well as you move forward just in this competition, but also down the road. I'm confident you'll be big successes. So anyway, thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for judging us. Honestly, I was freaking out for this, but this was like a good, positive experience. So thank you for not terrifying me. Yeah.
It's a lot easier on this side of the table, though we're not on the table, than on your side. So you're to be commended for how you did.
That's for sure.